Hey guys, Luton here, welcome back for another episode of Below the Line. This is a series I run weekly now, where we discuss gaming topics, trending issues or otherwise. The way this works, the format of the show is that every week I'll pose a question at the end of the video and you guys will comment about that down below. Then I'll take the best comments and we'll discuss them here for the first section of this video. At the end of this video, in the part 2, we'll have another question going forward to next week. Now, last time we were discussing the release of Divided Empires, a DLC for Rome 2, Creative Assembly revisiting that game basically and providing extra content for the community. And we were asking, does going back and revisiting your games actually provide for a better community? Is it a laudable thing for a developer to do? So first up, Claystead says, there's only one bad thing about releasing new DLC years down the line from the last update to the game. It breaks mods. With Rome 2, many of my sweet mods have not been touched for years due to the game being finished, and with the devs, he means the mod devs, moving on to whole new titles or just dropping modding altogether. He says, I think one of them is even dead. I shouldn't laugh, but that is just so obscure. He says, anyway, this now causes the issue that I have to revert the version of the game, which in turn means that if any of my mods do update, I may no longer be able to use them alongside the unupdated mods because basically it screws up the mods. This makes me suffer. For example, I use a mod that adds a couple of historical units to Sparta that were missing in the base game. I also use Radius to improve how those units work, but now Radius has stated that they will not make the mod compatible with 2.18 until he himself, who pioneered rebalancing, can afford to pay a couple from the old team to go back and fix it on their own time. So it's made in the intervening mods, I can no longer use them together. Had it been a Paradox title, I would have done it the hard way and fixed the mods myself, but I'm not an experienced coder in terms of Total War. This all frustrates me. And it's a good point, isn't it? I mean, mods are, for PC gaming anyway, a really core part of the games, especially games where the developer has moved on to other things. Often mods keep those games alive way beyond their natural lifespan. And for then a developer to come back in and do an update and put something back into the game which may affect certain units or may affect the way the game works. Again, if you were to do that like a year later, then maybe the modder will still be around. But 3 years down the line, chances are, like you say, those modders have maybe stopped gaming potentially. Sometimes people get burned out and they get older and they just think, oh, this isn't for me anymore. Or they move on to other games and they don't really have the passion, the interest which would take to create another mod for the game. And that's always been an issue with mods, and it's also been an issue with games which are endlessly under early access. Like literally at the moment I am praying for the day when RimWorld gets to a finished state, just so that mods can push forward, because love RimWorld and I'm absolutely, I can't wait for it to be in a really good state, and I also really want the developer to be able to actually do everything he wants to do in that game, so I want that to happen, but I'm also craving when it gets stable so we can do that. So in terms of a developer going back, that's definitely a negative, because yeah, you're right, often the reason why these games have a lifespan beyond their natural lifespan, the reason why there's still a community there often is down to modding. And also, as I've said before about mods, when you've been playing a game for a really long time with a mod which maybe fixes a really core element of a game, something which the developer just never really addressed, a lot of people get used to that mod, they become dependent on it, and you take it out of it, and that basically can kill the game for you. Sometimes not having a mod, like for example in City Skylines, if you were to take out some of the road mods in there, to my point of view, the game would be almost unplayable, so it can actually have a more devastating impact. So that's a really important thing to think about. Okay, next up, Too Passive says, I miss the old days when developers would release their game, not games, with an actual long-term plan, knowing that their next release would be around 3 or 4 years away. They build out the post-launch content with the community's involvement in mind. Back in the days of Duke Nukem 3D, Quake 2, Unreal Tournament, a developer would release their game and provide mod tools to the player base to further the longevity of the title. They'd also release a series of expansion packs, many of which were influenced by the direction of the mod scene which was going in, aka giving players what they wanted. You can see this with Arma, which has a thriving post-launch community. To be fair though, Arma is a kind of sandboxed game, so it's almost kind of implied that that's where it's going to go down, in a similar fashion something like Skylines, where again they were out the gate ready for mods to be a major part of it. Some games which are AAA don't necessarily want to even go down that route. Look at, again, we'll use the example Battlefield, they've been very clear, they really just don't want any of that. It's not on the table for them, so that is a factor to weigh in there. Okay, he carries on saying large investor driven game publishers like movie studios are more interested in selling repeatable micro Michael-based style franchises that in their first few outings rake in heaps of money, of course, but in the long term fizzle out because they lack the depth their community wants to stay engaged, of course, hence the constant need to reboot or refresh the area in which they are themed, of course. The developers are no longer given the time to really innovate with their gameplay mechanics until a few titles in, because of the pressure to get the next one out of the door. Again, of course. This has been evident in the sports franchise for years, and this same problem has now infected FPS driving adventure-style games like Assassin's Creed. Because gamers' most beloved franchises are investor-driven, they're going to continue to stagnate with limited gameplay and engine changes needed to keep them fresh. It shouldn't have taken the release of Battlefield 1 to introduce traversal mechanics that were already in Mirror's Edge, a game released by DICE in 2008. We need to look no further than Ubisoft Tom Clancy's library alone to see how many titles they have, and not one good Arma-like FPS game that has been created that truly incorporates all the mechanics used by their many franchises. I mean, honestly, what we're getting back to there is the kind of core of where developers are producing their games and how, whether they're producing them through like larger publishers compared to what they were back in the day where it was more like the developers were running the show. But to be fair, I often feel like people use sports games and even driving games as an example of kind of where things have gone now in terms of, quick, repeatable titles. But weren't sports and driving games always pretty quick and repeatable in terms of their content? Because, they're quite limited in scope, sports and driving games, because sports games, by their nature, are usually dictated to by the literal rules of those games. It's like there's real world demonstratable rules to go off of, and you're really going to struggle to branch out. In fact, actually branching out from those would probably be detrimental. I would imagine the audience would not really appreciate that. Similarly, driving games, they're pretty constrained by physics. And, again, depending on what kind of driving game you're doing, certain rules there as well. So again, they're quite limited in scope as opposed to something more like an FPS or an RTS or an RPG where you can really kind of branch out and be imaginative and kind of break the rules and go whichever direction you want to go. And therefore, there is kind of more rationale as to why an imaginative game could take longer or even less time, depending on what it is that you're doing there. So I think there is some grey areas there, but I think we would agree that, yeah, for sure, where we are now is not where we were years ago, but I mean, that's always going to be a pretty obvious thing to state. I guess the bigger question really is who's controlling the conversation at this point. Is it gamers? Is it developers? Is it publishers? I think up until recently you probably would have said it's definitely publishers, but I think given recent events you might actually say that gamers are more and more actually driving the conversation. You can be as cynical as you like about it, but I think there's definitely been impact. Right, Rob comes in saying, LT, tried hard to sit down and write something insightful and constructive about this topic, but the more I thought about it, the more I just get pissed off and turn into a grumpy old man. He says, I think I hate the average gamer, not my audience. Somebody who wants everything for free as if that were the way the world works. Yeah, it's kind of true. There is a large segment of people that feel that way often. And he says, my 7-year-old daughter is obsessed with these hatchables. These are toys that come in eggs, so you have to hatch them to see what they are. Obviously, you have to buy them to see what they are. Of course, this is classic. It's like card trading, pogs, whatever you want, right? Showing my age. The worst part is they come in different rarities, from common, of course they do. Common, rare, ultra rare, etc. Does this remind you of anything? Every time I see these damn hatchables, all I can think about is EA star cards and Ultimate Team cards. He says, all I can do is tell my daughter it shouldn't matter if it's rare or not, and she should just be happy with what she gets. Yeah, that's always going to work, right? And rarities don't matter because they're made up. I could give you a million examples of this. I just love the idea of trying to tell a 7-year-old the sort of rationale of the world and how this is not going to work. Playing cards, dolls, beanies, babies, etc. No surprise it's made its way into gaming. It's disgusting, but it's the world we live in. Whether it's random loot crates or DLCs or season passes or $100 games, we're going to have to pay for games one way or another, and concessions are going to need to be made on both sides, or else we're going to end up with many more Star Wars Battlefront 2 debacles in the future. Kind of a little bit off topic there, because we were talking about game franchises kind of going back and revisiting themselves, but I guess what you can take away is this constant conversation about how do you support a community. Do you support a community with kind of traditional traditional DLC, like what we're talking about with Total War, where they've revisited and gone back to support a release which is quite a few years old now? Or do you update it with modern day style DLC packages? Or even do we go down this route of kind of, loot crating, loot boxing stuff where you get all free DLC? I think the point is that, from Rob's comment there, the idea that this isn't something which is just isolated to games. That's really the main thing to note there. It's that it pervades everything. And also that this has been something which has been going on for a long time. And I would just say, if you even go back a really long way, like 20, 25, go back not into just gaming, but this idea of, honestly, I was thinking recently around the kind of gambling sort of aspect of loot boxes. Seriously, it's been there forever with kids. It's just that nobody's ever addressed it. Whether it's bloody football trading cards, or whether it's Magic the Gathering, or whether it's whatever you want it to be, Pokemon or whatever, right? It doesn't really matter. These things have been there for ages. They are essentially gambling. These things have been there forever in many different numerous forms for kids, where it's like, hey, buy a pack of X thing and you may get something in there. You might get a shiny. Remember, it was always about the shiny cards, right? It's no different. It's no different. It's always been there. And actually, as an adult, when I look back to some of the stuff that was there for kids, it really makes you question, like, wow, why did nobody pick up on this? Because it seems clear as day that it's pretty bullshit, and that it is, as I say, gambling for kids. Why was this never brought up? Right, Cobbler's back in, mainly because I like his Bumblebee avatar, but also because he makes a good point. Supporting older games that a handful of players own, absolutely. It's one of the main reasons I got Empire Divided, actually. I have a tendency to buy games to support mid-tier and indie devs, either due to seemingly low sales or business practices I approve. In this case, it's the latter with Empire Divided. The new factions, more in-depth politics system, and more in Empire Divided sounded nice, but the retroactive support for an older game was what sold me on this DLC. This DLC strategy, Attila is getting a new expansion to later, and long-term support for games, i.e. Company Heroes 2, is good for consumers because it's more likely that the player base will be larger, as these games will have had price drops and multiple sales. Company Heroes 2 regularly goes on sale, it does. I know a few who haven't gotten the new Warhammer games because they are priced much higher, myself included. I assume a handful might not be able to run the Warhammer games as well due to their older GPUs, whereas games like Rome 2 seem to run decently now on older GPUs. And the first thing I want to do is come back to the first comment we had today from Claystead, talking about how this DLC for Rome 2 actually breaks a lot of the mods and therefore is very frustrating. Now, I don't know the stats of how many people with Total War in terms of Rome 2 or in general Total War, how many people actually run mods. But what I will tell you is I was amazingly shocked when I was at Rezzed in London. That's the sort of indie game expo in London, and they had Paradox there, and they were talking about City Skylines. They were doing a big talk, and people could stand up and ask questions, and I decided to stand up and ask some questions about a few different things. Now, one of them was I was talking about mods, and I was talking about this core mods idea, the idea that, do they ever want to get in on, like I say, mods which are core to the game franchise so that they never go away. And something that came back which shocked me from the developer was that they said, according to their stats, only something like 25-30% of the player base of City Skylines actually run mods. That is such a staggeringly low amount for the entire community. And it really made me realize, holy crap, it's so easy to run mods now, because you literally just go Steam, go sub, and that's it. That's all you got to do. There's nothing more difficult to it than that, and to be fair, it never was that hard anyway. You just move it into a folder or whatever, right, to run it on the game. And it's just staggering that so few people are actually giving themselves the opportunity to run mods. So this is the thing, when you have Cobbler talking about communities which are existing there because maybe, again, they're slightly older games, they run on older hardware, also the fact that people want to support games for different reasons, whether it's just that they like mid-level developers or whatever, but also the vibe that I get from Cobbler is that, he's part of that kind of player base who just enjoy the game for what it is. They're not necessarily there to kind of tweak and push and make it become this whole other thing. They're just there to enjoy the games for what they are and are very appreciative for this kind of update, and again might see that there's an update, revisit it, and again kind of pump some new blood back into that franchise. So it's an interesting counterpoint, I think, to the first comment we had today. Okay, the last comment for today is not specifically about developers going back and revisiting and providing new content in terms of the Empire Divided stuff for Rome 2, but it is referencing to subscription models, and I thought it was a very good comment, very well written, and I think it's relevant still within the context of this whole issue we've been talking about, which is essentially how do developers and publishers support their titles further down the line, and that's still part of the whole conversation. So Chaos Puppy says, if Battlefield or AAA games like it move back to a subscription model, it'd be a disaster for those games. You only have to look at the MMO market to understand why. While $15 a month isn't a terrible price, when you own several games, as most gamers do, it adds up. You might have Battlefront 2, COD, Overwatch, Destiny. Suddenly you are paying $60 a month. That's if they were all subscription model, which if you pretty much buy only one game a month now, after you get 4, you're never going to be able to buy any more games for years to come unless you drop a game. Even if publishers allow you access to all their games for a sub fee, for example, kind of like Origin Access, these are different publishers, so it'd still be $60 a month. In other words, it would help, but it wouldn't be solving that subscription fatigue. So what happens with subscription fatigue? Gamers stop subscribing to all but the games that they like the most, basically. It sounds very simple, but, well, let's say a hypothetical gamer looks at all the above games and addresses his FPS needs in some way, but he can't afford $60 a month. So he sides with his favourite game at that time, let's say Destiny 2. This means that this gamer is now never going to play Battlefront 2, because even if he wants to play it one night in the future and owns it, the subscription basically becomes a paywall to entry. Effectively, Battlefront 2, I think he meant Destiny 2, sub permanently removes that gamer from Battlefront 2. The Battlefront community would then lose that gamer that otherwise would have been present. This is what happened in MMOs and why you can't use World of Warcraft as an example, like I did. He says the most popular MMO, World of Warcraft, was the one most gamers chose, and the sub fee to other MMOs just became a paywall to entry. Those other MMOs had their communities fail to the point where they moved then to free-to-play models. Only MMOs with a strong or established fanbase that essentially are not going to play any other game can maintain a subscription model. So, to build communities and entice players away from games like WoW, you see free-to-play models, and some MMOs have even gone as far as to adopt the AAA model of buy once and play forever, like Elder Scrolls Online and Guild Wars 2. Let's add on top of this, in any subscription model, the gamer expects to have access to a huge world with volumes of content on release, not a handful of maps with some maybe to come in the future, like Battlefront. If the content of a game is light, gamers will quickly churn through it and drop their sub, and yet again the sub becomes a barrier to entry. Now, I thought that was a good comment, but I also think that there are a few things to highlight with that. One, a lot of assumptions in there, okay? A lot of assumptions assuming that a game would just go straight for the $15 as they used to with WoW. Now, WoW was an MMO, it was an RPG, it's a very, very different style of game. So let's say something like Battlefield, which rightly pointed out was, maybe less maps and less general content in there. Well, who's to say that it's going to have that $15? Also, you're kind of assuming that games would stay on a kind of existing plane like they are now, like the model in terms of maps and the way the development goes for releasing those maps in terms of packs, etc., would stay the same. There's nothing to say that that would necessarily be the case. My thinking and exploration about, like, hey, would subscription models work in other games, like FPS games like Battlefield or something along these lines, was on the assumption that the developers would then look at it in a different light. So yeah, you would maybe start off with a relatively modest amount of content, but then it would be more regularly released. They'd probably have some prepped and ready to go to sort of release it as and when that community was ready, and then continue to improve and enhance and do something. So, it's assuming that potentially there's other content which is going to come down the line there. Also, it was assuming that kind of suddenly, for some reason, all games would transition over to this subscription model, which again was something I never said. It's quite a jump for people to assume that that's something that would be the case. I don't see why that would happen. We were talking really specifically about just certain issues, but it's still a good comment nonetheless, and I think it does, raise some questions for people to think about in terms of just kind of what people can afford. And I think, again, you really have to get into some statistics there and some averages to really kind of think like, okay, if this happened on a larger scale, how would it affect things? I don't think it's going to anyway. I think it's more just a hypothetical to get people thinking about, like, hey, how do we pay our games, and what other options are there available for that? Okay, now we come to part 2, where I'm going to be discussing a topic for you guys to answer down below in the comments, which will then go forward into the next video next week. So today's question is about how we play games now. Moreover, how we learn about games. Does it always have to be about playing to win and doing so as efficiently as possible? Obviously, this depends on what game it is that you're actually playing, but it's interesting that people's personal goals for games are maybe more interesting when people deny themselves experiences by forcefully putting constraints on their own gameplay, or say having unreasonable expectations of success and then feeling the need to kind of somehow make that become a reality. For a long time now, people have relied on wikis and guides for how to improve themselves in games, which might be too challenging, or perhaps a genre you haven't experienced before and want to get better at. Wikis and guides are nothing new, they've been around forever for those players who are not wanting to really tax their brain or perhaps just don't want to miss any part of a game, no matter how trivial. On the other hand, there might be games out there which have just done a really poor job of explaining things, and they're there for that reason as well. Most games require a considered period of learning and trial and error to achieve their goals, but beyond that, what are the differences in terms of a sense of achievement between people who approach a game with a success by any means necessary idea, such as using wikis, constant saving to ensure clean success, as opposed to players who take a more let the chips fall where they may approach? In a single player environment, this is really down to an individual. Some might not want to go through the punishment of replaying for the sake of some small oversight in a puzzle, or in a sandbox game like City Skylines, people may just want to gain knowledge before embarking on a build, not wasting what little time they have in a trial by error process and finding out 15 hours down the line that they made some mistake many hours ago that now requires them to do a large redesign. I think the key difference when thinking about achievement is narrative. Games without much of a narrative, like sandbox building games or management games, which are focused around just the mechanical gameplay experience, really don't suffer greatly from players who want to learn by doing versus those who want to learn by researching ahead of time. Ultimately, that's a subjective choice for the player to make based on what they want to get out of the game. Take for example some survival games as well though, like Subnautica or Stranded Deep. They require the player to figure out the early stages of how to survive and handle that game environment. It's part of what the game is about. But tutoring the player reasonably without breaking immersion versus holding their hand is a hard line to walk, especially when you have no point of reference for your average player's experience, age, or general common sense skills. Narrative and RPG games are a different situation. Your choices to right or wrong often dictate or at least influence further outcomes and consequences. Games like Stardew Valley, Mass Effect series, RimWorld, Fallout, and think back to games like Heavy Rain. So mostly we're talking about RPGs here, because they tend to have strong narratives and multiple ending options. It's not just about endings though, it's also about the actual effects on your gameplay experience. What you get down to is really what is it that you want to get out of that game. I think if you're playing something heavy on narrative or even self-told narrative with something like RimWorld, where there's very limited actual narrative in there, it comes from you weaving your own stories from the plights of your colonists. Narrative games essentially expect you to want to be immersed into the game, as is the nature of the genre, so everything is designed to pull you in, and mistakes and everything should be part of that. Failure is part of life, and so it should be part of some games. We learn and we experience different feelings through that lack of perfection. It's why I often say that I like to make errors in games. I actually love it. I crave things to go wrong because mistakes and failure, for me, especially in a narrative and RPG game, are part and parcel of that experience, and that really triggers some people. Also, I feel that you should really be able to play a game without a wiki sitting alongside you as a reference guide. Sure, having that wealth of knowledge just a few keystrokes away is a safety blanket for you, but it also raises the question, do some developers just skimp on bothering with figuring out an intuitive way to tell a player how to do something because they're thinking, well, somebody's going to wiki this later or make a tutorial on it. I kind of doubt that's how it goes down, but that's often how it feels when you run into something that you feel surely should be more easily understood, even as a player with thousands of hours of gaming behind them. Of course, guides, wikis, top tips, tutorials, all optional and a choice for the individual. But with the sheer volume of knowledge available now at instant access, do we lose a little bit of the magic in games? The repetitive struggle to discover and the joy and sense of achievement when you finally figure it out, I think that's one of the most fantastic elements of gaming. And I could easily think back to games like Myst and Riven, really challenging games which nowadays people are surely just going to do a quick Google search when they get stuck. But for me, required hours of logical stress trying to figure out what fragment of information it was I'd overlooked that I needed to do to actually progress any further in the game. So the question of the day is, do you really wish someone had told you that thing before you started playing a game, or were you happy to learn through your own mistakes and satisfaction of knowing that you did it your own way, not following a paint-by-numbers guide? Personally, if we're going to just follow the guidebook and instructions, I actually wonder why you'd just play at all.